This is absolutely explosive. While you were sleeping, the true scale of Rachel Reeves's inheritance tax rate has been revealed, and it's far worse than anyone imagined. We're not talking about hitting the super rich anymore. We're talking about ordinary families. People earning just $20,000 a year, getting slammed with inheritance tax bills that could reach $170,000. This isn't just policy anymore. This is financial devastation for Middle Britain. If this story shocks you as much as it should, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for the latest UK news that matters to your family's future. The numbers coming out today are staggering. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that in 2027 to 28, the average inheritance tax liability will be $169,000, rising by around $34,000 when pension assets are included. Think about that for a moment. Nearly $170,000 taken from grieving families at their most vulnerable moment. And this isn't hitting millionaires in mansions. This is hitting people who died exactly what every government told them to do, save for retirement and buy a home. Here's where it gets absolutely brutal. These changes mean inheritance tax is no longer something just the rich have to worry about. It's starting to hit average working families who have simply saved into a pension and bought a home. The very people who played by the rules, who scrimped and saved, who built modest nest eggs for their children, are now facing what experts are calling a double whammy tax grab. Rachel Reeves stood at that dispatch box and promised this would only affect the wealthy. She looked the British public in the eye and said working families had nothing to fear, but the reality is catastrophic. Currently, inheritance tax is charged at 40% on estates above the nil rate band of $325,000, and that threshold hasn't moved for years, while house prices have soared through the roof. But here's where it gets even more sinister. From April 2027, pension policies would become subject to inheritance tax, meaning your retirement savings, the money you put away for decades, will now be taxed when you die. Inherited pension pots will be subject to inheritance tax at the standard 40% rate. Imagine working for 40 years, saving every penny you can into your pension, only for the government to take 40% of it when your family needs it most. The scale of this raid is breathtaking. We're looking at an additional 150,000 families getting dragged into inheritance tax every single year. That's 150,000 families who never expected to pay death duties, who aren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, suddenly facing bills that could bankrupt them. A pensioner has accused, Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves of stealing their retirement after budget changes left them facing a £640,000 inheritance tax bill. £640,000 from someone's pension. Let that sink in. And it gets worse, much worse. Some families could face what is being called a triple tax raid. This represents a double tax hit for bereaved families, who will first face the standard 40% IHT charge, but in some cases, pensions could be taxed at a far higher rate, with some calculations suggesting families could lose up to 87% of inherited pensions. 87%. That's not taxation, that's confiscation. The human impact of this is devastating. Picture this scenario. You're a teacher, a nurse, a shop worker earning $25,000 a year. You've bought a modest 3-bedroom house for $280,000, well below the national average in many areas. You've diligently paid into your workplace pension for 35 years, building up a pot of $200,000. When you die, your family faces inheritance tax, not just on the house, but now on your pension too. The total estate value pushes them well over the threshold, and suddenly, your grieving spouse and children owe the government tens of thousands of pounds. They simply don't have. Under current rules, pensions are considered a tax-efficient way to save. But this will change when they become subject to the 40% death duty rate from April 2027. Generations of British workers were encouraged to save into pensions, with the promise that these savings would provide security for their families. Now, Rachel Reeves has torn up that social contract and turned your life savings into a government cash grab. What makes this even more insulting is the timing. All long-term residents would be subject to inheritance tax on their worldwide assets. Yet at the same time, this government is softening tax rules for wealthy foreigners who threaten to leave the country. So if you're a billionaire with offshore accounts, you get breaks. If you're a British worker with a modest pension, you get hammered. The agricultural sector is already in revolt. From April 2026, taxes would apply to agricultural assets over 1 metre, though the government has said this would just affect the wealthiest landowners. But farmers know better. Farming groups have argued the policy is a threat to the future of family farming, and the UK, as food security, these aren't wealthy tax dodgers. These are families who've worked the land for generations, and now they're being forced to sell up to pay Rachel Reeves' death taxes. The broader economic impact is already showing. Investment is at its lowest level in the G7. Entrepreneurs are selling their businesses rather than passing them down because the inheritance tax burden makes it impossible. We're creating an economy where success is punished, where building something for the next generation is financially toxic. More families will be drawn into the web of inheritance tax from 2027, and some of those will need to start planning now if they want to mitigate the effects. But here's the cruel irony. The very wealthy have armies of accountants and offshore structures to avoid these taxes. It's the middle class, the backbone of Britain, who'll pay the price. This isn't just bad policy, it's a betrayal of everything we were told about Labour's plans. They promised to tax the wealthy. Instead, they devastating working families. They promised to fix the economy. Instead, they're driving investment away and punishing savers. They promised fairness. Instead, they've created a system where your crime is being responsible with money. The question now is whether the British public will stand for this. Whether families earning $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year will accept that their modest life savings are now fair game for a government desperate for cash. Whether will allow Rachel Reeves to turn inheritance tax from a levy on the super rich into a death penalty for Middle Britain. This is the biggest tax grab in a generation, disguised as fairness, but targeting the very people who can least afford it. And it's only going to get worse.